Hello, my name is Tom Sendejas, and I am a theology teacher at Loyola High School of Los Angeles. This workshop is breaking down the silence, building up campuses that include our LGBTQ students and faculty. And this workshop is going to be bold in the sense that we're going to accept the reality that LGBTQ people are in our midst and that they've been in the margins too long and too painfully. And if you're here, then I'm hoping that you want to think about what are next steps. And so this will be a practical oriented workshop, although it'll certainly have theological and moral and philosophical overtones. I have been teaching since 1980 theology. I've taught courses in everything from social justice, peace studies, scripture, morality and ethics, human sexuality, death and dying, and in all of those courses, I'm going to show you in a moment, I've learned to develop lesson plans that organically incorporate LGBTQ issues because of, you'll see that my teaching career sort of paralleled that time frame of a lot of those developments. And of course, students want to talk about these issues in class. And I think it's important that we meet that need for a variety of reasons. Please excuse my pandemic hair. I'm definitely, I guess, finally going for the old, the prophet look. And this workshop is going to be, I get to use that word, robust. It's full of content, and I can already tell you, I've run through it a couple times. It's an hour's worth of content I'm going to try to fit into a half hour. So what I will do is, and what I invite you to do is I will click through slides, sometimes quickly, and I invite you to use your pause button to read them a little bit more thoroughly if you like. Towards the end, I'm going to have suggestions for lessons for teachers in a variety of disciplines: social studies, art, music, writing, English. So, and I probably won't be able to get to those, but they're explanatory there. And then at the end, I do have some quotes that I think are very meaningful as to why we do this work. And so, and I believe it is good work and holy work. So I hope you'll stay for those. So like I say, when I realize I'm getting to about the 30-minute mark, I'll probably just pause and then click through the rest of the slides. So thank you in advance for being here and holding space for this workshop. This is also going to be more qualitative data than quantitative for reasons you might surmise. It is difficult to get data from and to get LGBTQ students and faculty staff to come forward because of fear and anonymity reasons. So, but teaching as long as I have a number of former students who identify within that community who are willing to contribute some quotes, which I will be interspersing throughout. So I also want to mention the pronouns. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm going to be using terms like LGBTQ with the Q intended to include, this is not ideal, but to include various other letters that people identify with. Please be merciful with me if I'm not the most elegant in all the terminology, but we're all struggling and growing. And this workshop is going to be focused on the modus. That is not just can we have culturally competent or adequate campuses in these areas, but can we be proficient? Can we do the more? This is just a diagram, forgive my cartooning here, just to show how we have sometimes, through being fear-based, built up blocks or a wall that is separating our LGBTQ students, teachers, and staff and parishioners from feeling welcome within the community. And that is not something that any of our doctrine calls for. Our doctrine calls for all to be included and to not be discriminated against. And so with that presumption, and if that's why you're here, then I want to just let you know that, you're welcome and you're heard. And however you identify with as an ally or within the community, or just open to learning. I'm simply going to show you this quick timeline only to let you know that when I started teaching in 1980, these were the kinds of issues, and this is just a small fraction of the kinds of issues that were going on in the country. And it's maybe surprising to some, but the Archdiocese, when the AIDS pandemic happened, the Archdiocese actually mandated that Catholic schools be the ones, Catholic departments, Catholic theology teachers be the ones who handled instruction about HIV and AIDS. And students, of course, had questions because this pandemic in the beginning was initially impacting, at least the way it was being reported, was impacting the gay male population. Of course, the lesbian and transgender community responded to it. And so students had questions, and I had to develop lesson plans at that time. And through the years, that's been the case. I teach about Catholic social teaching, about morality and ethics. So discussions of, whether to go to prom with a same-sex date, all these kinds of issues, don't ask, don't tell, athletes coming out, representation in the media, same-sex adoption, Matthew Shepard, the rise in teen suicides, the debate over same-sex marriage, the torture of gays globally, and of course, Father Martin's advocacy, Pope Francis's comments on the topic. These are all appropriate to discussion theology classes, and therefore I've had to develop curriculum on that. And so what I'm going to be sharing is coming from that perspective, that there's some things I've learned that I think are helpful and some that are not helpful, and that's the place I'll be coming from. I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to share 3 stories with you. I'm going to start with the story of a student I once taught some years ago named Daniel. He was a pleasure to teach, bright, highly organized. In fact, he quickly became my student aide in the class, highly dependable. And eventually he would go on to be one of our top graduates. But after 9th grade, it's a big school, and I lost some contact with him. I just see him on campus. I thought he was flourishing until he got to his senior year, and he started publishing in the student newspaper editorials, talking about the need for space for LGBTQ students, some of the pain he had endured here on campus. And so I asked to meet with him and reconnect. And I was theology department chair at the time. And I just asked, I wanted to apologize if I'd hurt him in any way, and then ask if there was things that my department could do better. And he shared a story that told me that we could do better in our call to teach as Jesus did. And that was that Daniel had an experience in one of his classes, theology classes, where the textbook by Michael Pennock mentioned homosexuality in a way that he perceived as positive. It was more focused on the not being discriminatory and biased aspects of church teaching. And so he was waiting all semester for that, because he was finding himself very tormented by his growing awareness of his sexual identity, which was gay. And so he waited and waited, and the day finally came where it should be, where they were that part of the book. And what happened was that they got there, and then the teacher, for whatever reason, this is not a comment on the teacher per se, but the teacher skipped over it, did not mention it. And the impact on Daniel was serious. It sent him further into depression. It made him think, if we're not worthy of mention in theology class, then what places are going to be in for this church, where he was already an altar server and very involved. And And why couldn't, and you know, he had hoped his classmates who had heard kind of anti-gay remarks, he'd hoped that they would have been instructed by this, and so he was devastated. And I ask you to think about, what would a student feel like in that situation? Like they're not even worth a few minutes. Would you feel lost, unworthy, even in a Christian religion class? The next time we had the school liturgy and we sang "All Are Welcome in This Place," would you feel welcome? Maybe you even glance down the aisle at a teacher who you think might be LGBT, and then you would wonder, you know, how are they treated, and is this my future? So I ask you to think about that story and the theme of it. I'm now going to move on to another story. I imagine that many of us are familiar with this work in some way, A Raisin in the Sun, classic play about African-American life and the challenges faced. We know it was the first play by a Black woman to go to Broadway, but who wrote it? And I bet a lot of you know that it was written by Lorraine Hansberry. And so what I'm wondering is, we know that this was a play that has been called such a classic that it's changed American theater forever, according to a prominent critic. Where did you first encounter it? Was it in a classroom? Was it assigned reading? And if so, did the teacher mention that Lorraine Hansberry was a lesbian? And we now have scholarship on that that's pretty good. And so a question that might be uncomfortable for us to look at, but let's lean into it a little bit. If the teacher didn't talk about that part of Hansberry's identity, why not? I posed this question once to some colleagues who also taught at Catholic high school, and these are some of the responses that I got. They didn't think they could talk about it at Catholic school, or that it wasn't important, that it might actually be offensive to point it out, that they didn't know, they'd never been taught that, or variations on why should it matter. So let's look at that question. Why should it matter that Hansberry was lesbian and Black? If we look at another part of her identity, Blackness, would anyone say that didn't matter in her work? Or that she wouldn't think about it as a person every day? And so why wouldn't we think that would be true of another part of her identity? And then I asked to think about, what if a student discovers down the line that Hansberry was lesbian, and then wonders, why didn't my teacher mention that? And that starts to send a message that, you know, this topic is not comfortable. Now I want you to think about the fact that Hansberry was friends with James Baldwin, who, as we know, was one of our great intellectuals, one of the people who is most cited even in today as being prescient about race relations. Even the movie that was made about him, an excellent movie, I Am Not Your Negro, his queerness is minimized, despite that he's written a classic of LGBT literature, and it contributed to his sense of being an outsider. So let's now start to develop a lesson plan. What if we had students in a writing class or English class, let's say, or a drama class, meet in small groups? And the task is that they were to write a dialogue or a short play or a video. And the idea is that Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin are hanging around on a Saturday night. Or maybe they're about to go to a civil rights event where they're speaking. What are they talking about? And what would your students need to know for them to do this accurately, right? So one thing would be to research what were conditions like for Negroes back then, and were they different for men and for women? And then what were conditions like for gay people in 1950s America? And they might find out things like there were shock treatments used on people, and it was considered a mental illness, and it prevented people from serving in the military, or all kinds of different aspects that people felt like the only place they could hang out was in a bar. And even then, that's where they would be targeted for raids. And then if we had the students think about this, what would Lorraine and James agree on? What would they disagree on? Would there be different perspectives due to their gender? Does it contribute to their feelings of being outsiders by being Black and queer? What would be their hopes for America if they could travel in time today? What would they say? These are fascinating questions. I could tell you I would want to see those plays. I think it sounds like a great lesson plan. And students would learn about marginalized groups and how they've been treated. They would learn speculative writing, dramatic writing. They would hopefully maybe look into each person's spiritual journey as well. They'd learn about intersectionality. LGBTQ students would feel validated, and heterosexual students would be taught how to talk about these issues in a respectful way, because the teacher would create guidelines and boundaries. Now let's go to another story. Some of you may know his story or have heard of him. This is Dan Choi. Dan Choi, a Korean American who from Orange County, California, who was a top high school athlete and scholar, and who, after seeing Saving Private Ryan, wanted to serve in the American military. And he did. He went to West Point, graduated with high honors and degrees as a linguist, and served for in Iraq, and then began to question this policy of don't ask, don't tell. And when he came out nationally, the military discharged him. And this is an interesting point to look at how his skills, as valuable as they were seen as worth sacrificing. And he wasn't the only one. And his objections were moral. So let's say I'm teaching an ethics class, a morality class, right? And he also grew up a Christian. And his argument when he came out to his parents was, I refuse to bear false witness to you. And when it came to don't ask, don't tell, he said he had moral issues with it, that he was taught a cadet doesn't lie, that it violated the very thing that he was fighting for everybody's life to be free and recognized as full persons. And that it was immoral because lying like this causes trauma. And it is, to keep something hidden is a lie in many ways, right? So now we could start looking at this another way. I offer this as an exercise for us to reflect on as well in all our communities, because I think there's something to be learned from this. Where does don't ask, don't tell exist within the Catholic Church? Where does it exist within our student bodies? And I use that term advisedly because bodies contain and are affected by sustained trauma. And so what would that be like if we were thought about that, right? Let's imagine how our communities are impacted. Do you know somebody or think you know somebody who might be living under this kind of pressure? How often are you aware of it in your life compared to how often they're aware of it? And then reflect, what would it do to those people if they could live more freely? How would that lift their spirit and their health? And how would it impact the health of our schools and communities around the world? So let's begin to look at some of the issues or things we can do. Here I'm going to use the tool of helpful or not helpful. I know it's binary, but I'm just going to go into some kind of tool here. Here's a helpful thing to use. It's an empathy exercise. I borrowed it from a Jesuit Global Ministries. They have this empathy device called the red chair. You can paint a chair red, sit it in your classroom, it's empty. But when you want to have a discussion about people who are marginalized or vulnerable, who don't have a voice, you can bring this chair forward. And at this point, what we do is we start to imagine, what are the messages that person is getting? What is their life like? And this diagram, again, excuse my poor drawing here, but I just want to get across, when I've done this with students or with groups of teachers, here are the kinds of messages that we generate, right? We find there's all kinds of messages. And once you see it like this, you recognize how a person who's LGBTQ, especially in a religious or Catholic community, how much anxiety they might be feeling. And that anxiety can go into depression, and that can go into self-harm. And that's why this is life-saving work. Something that's helpful is to look with fierce honesty at our campuses to see whether they're superficially inclusive. We had an anti-bullying week, we have a few posters here, we have some safe space signs up, or are they deeply and authentically safe spaces and serving our LGBTQ populations? Is there heterosexual privilege that keeps us from examining these issues? Not helpful is over focus on, whether or not we can have a gay straight alliance and the bishop will allow that, or the topic of dates. I know these are important topics. I don't want to minimize them at all. I, at my campus, do work with a diversity club that is welcoming of LGBTQ students. I have wonderful co-moderators, Angela Moran and Rosie Morales, who work on this with me, and they do incredible work. I cannot emphasize enough. Of course, this is important. If I can give a suggestion of a way to do this, by the way, I would say we have a book in our midst by the wonderful Father James Martin called Building a Bridge, right? And so we could, do that, study that in a classroom, or we could study that at lunchtime, different chapters that would provoke discussion. But going beyond that, over focusing on that ignores something, and I'm going to illustrate. We say we don't have gay straight alliances, but I'm going to say we do. And they're your classroom, they're your team, they're your club. And but what I mean by that is, students aren't, of course, we're not asking them to, and they're not disclosing where they are in their process, but they are at that time where either their sexual identity has been confirmed to them in a fairly rapid way, or they might have questions, or they're questioning, or they're in process. They may be coming out, they may be experiencing their gender identity in ways that have not found acceptance in their community. And so just to remind us that we have gay, straight students in our classes, and we have a perfect opportunity then to teach lessons and have experiences that will create allyship in natural ways, especially when we realize that we're talking about, the perspective that we are called to save lives and not to be biased. So this means doing interrogation work of ourselves. This is helpful. Where is our own internalized homophobia or anti-gay sentiment? And this can occur even within LGBTQ people too. We can all internalize oppression. So we all have to do this interrogation work. It's also helpful if our LGBTQ staff and faculty are involved in your policy decisions. This is a win-win because you're going to gain a valuable perspective. I can't imagine if we had a Black Student Association that we'd only let white people lead it and make policy decisions for it, or for Latine Heritage Month, or for Asian Pacific Islanders. We wouldn't do that for them, and yet in many of our schools, heterosexual people are making all the decisions, all the discussions, even all the sort of creation of dialogue on this topic without inviting. And I know it's delicate because some teachers are not out, but some teachers are or want to be involved in this work. Have we asked? Have we invited? The insights from the adult population could be very valuable. These are just some examples of issues that could be addressed better with all those perspectives included. Something that's not helpful is overdependence on anti-bullying campaigns, or thinking, as important as it is to make sure that we, at the beginning, make sure that we do talk about respectful language and set boundaries in our classrooms. So as important as that is, at the same time, we can feel like, well, we've talked about that, so now we're done. And until we get at the systemic roots of why this language persists in our communities, the F slur is only going to go on to something else, and then they'll be saying something else like no homo, and then they'll get something else, which we I have heard insults recently that are being done in the athletic field that thankfully, like in San Diego, where they stood up to that kind of language, but it's only going to continue until we address these in a systemic way. And our church backs us up in the sense of that, nobody in our faith communities, certainly not anybody we minister to as Jesus did, should be undergoing this kind of an acceptance. These are good quotes. I'm gonna flick through them kind of quickly, but ask you to pause and to read them more carefully, because they address these topics. Something that would be helpful is to refresh our education and our guidance departments. Our school counselors are first responders often in this crisis with LGBTQ students. Are they familiar with the various stage theories and coming out? Too many people think coming out is just a sort of one-time thing. There's many stages that are fraught in that process. I'll have a slide about that later on. Are they familiar with the language youth use? Do they know in our environments, it's important for the counselors to know contemporary theological teaching instead of just making assumptions about that, because many of the students will have those questions. How familiar are they with college campuses that will accept them? In that coming out process, let's recognize that there are various stages, sometimes 5 or 6. Not everybody goes through them, but they may, and the more we can get awareness of that, how these processes can create great anxiety, we start to understand that, this student who's struggling may not be listening in our classroom or may not be fully present, because this anxiety can be so profound, or it can lead to depression. Perhaps they're dealing with a conflict with their parents. COVID is perhaps exacerbating this for students who aren't out to their parents. They don't have that time to be with a friend group that gives them a break in the day that's more accepting. For trans students who might be expressing themselves in another way outside the home or outside the school day, they're experiencing challenges and difficulties. So what we can do to educate ourselves on these topics is important. Something that's helpful is being attentive to the various ways students disclose. There's a movie that I recommend. It's a TV movie. It's very TV movie-ish. It's called Prayers for Bobby. I would advise you to really be careful in how you would use it. But it has made many of my students and some teachers really think through our faith reactions to LGBTQ students and the impact that they can have. The movie does have a story about self-harm. So let's say I show that movie with all the precautions and attention that I can, and then I ask students to reflect on that. As I have, if I'm not attentive, I'm going to miss out that sometimes students who are not comfortable going to, even if we have sort of a safe space or LGBTQ alliance kind of thing, they're still not comfortable that. And where do they come out? I've seen them come out in their writing, in their homework, when you talk about topics. And that means being really attentive. Not helpful is phrases like, oh, it doesn't matter if somebody's gay, or it doesn't matter who you date or sleep with or go home to, it's none of my business. That's the LGBTQ version of I don't see color, right? They are enduring suffering and exclusion and turmoil about this, so it has to matter to us. I think it's very important that we support our LGBTQ teachers while they teach. This is going to sound shocking, but we can't wait until people are fired, right? And so we have to recognize that they are not the only ones who are they're the only ones who are really forced to make a decision about being out. Heterosexual teachers are out about their sexual orientation all the time. When they talk about their opposite gender spouse, telling a story in class or a retreat talk. I want you to think about how LGBTQ teachers often never get to give their authentic Kairos talk. I'd ask you to consider that there's other ways to support teachers. If only LGBTQ teachers are the ones who are teaching units or lessons on this topic, then there's a chance they're going to be targeted as the gay teacher. They could be bullied, and then the lack of supports already happen. The more heterosexual ally teachers who teach on these topics, not just in ways that are like, sort of trite phrases, excuse my description of that, like, oh, and who else is marginal? Oh yeah, gay people, right? And then we just go on. But actually doing lessons about this, these are ways in which we can be supportive as well as in our social behavior. I'm going to go through these quickly, but please pause and read them, these next quotes. These are quotes about how teachers are treated socially in their communities. Helpful, not helpful is, what does a safe space really mean? It's not enough to say, oh, all the queer kids come to my classroom and hang out. Well, there are kids that I can tell you probably aren't, right? And but we might stop there and be satisfied there. Or I've got a poster up, I've got a rainbow flag here. Very important, but we could do the modus in this area. Another quotes, I'm going to pass by these quickly, but please take time to read them. It's helpful to have a structure for students who come out on retreats. We see this going on. We need a supported structure and one that's informed. And I don't just mean on the retreat itself. There's a mountaintop experience. Some kids come out in a talk, they're on the team, they get support immediately. Maybe they come out, their small group supports them. But then they come back to school. And as many of us have experienced on retreats, we think, oh, did I just say that or do that? Was I that vulnerable? Was that support real? And so we need structured, educated, trauma-informed, queer culture-informed follow-up to be responsive to these students and offer it to them. Even if they just say, I'm fine, the offer will mean something if we know the right questions to ask, not just, hey, I'm just checking in with you, how you doing? This is going to be help for catechists and religion teachers. I've been to seminars where I've heard people say, I don't know how to teach on this. I feel like I have to teach something I disagree with, or it's going to cause controversy. I'm going to say the wrong thing. And so I have an approach I suggest that I've worked with. I just approach it by talking theologically about many, as I do with many issues, which is, let's look at the spectrum of church teaching on this topic, and let's inform our consciences, and let's try to present it as clearly and non-biased as we possibly can. And I don't use the term conservative or liberal theology because students confuse that with political positions. So I try images like church as fortress, middle path, church as field hospital. And when you do that, if I show church as fortress, then this model is sort of aligned with the idea that the church is under attack by modern forces. Let's understand why people have that concern or fear, what they want to defend its more traditional dogma on human sexuality and gender. Let's look at what that is. How does this make sense to you, etc.? What are the limitations? What are the strengths, if any? Then we go to a middle path. And this is sort of, trying to that tricky road of navigating, I know there's LGBTQ people in our parish, but, I don't know how to teach them in terms of catechism or etc. And then the field hospital, which is Pope Francis's symbol, that where people are hurting, we don't wait for them to come to us, we go to them. And that's the spirit of this talk as well, right? So I ask questions here. What would that mean, going out to the field of LGBTQ people in our world, in our midst? How would we care for them? What are some contemporary theologians and ministers saying about that? And when you do this, it cools down the topic, and you've covered church teachings in an analytical way, nuanced way. You're not students don't perceive you're trying to pressure them or bias them. You're taking an inquiry approach that respects their informed conscience. It's sort of like the movie The Two Popes, where we see that dialogue, that tension, which exists, and tension is okay to exist and often does, right? And even in Jesus's time, there was Pharisaical tensions, the tension of the Sadducees, all their various approaches, right? So when you teach, when you do teach the field hospital approach, I will say this helps LGBTQ students to feel seen, to feel heard. It gives them an opportunity to speak, and you get to set the respectful boundaries of that conversation. And here's a quote about, when I've used this approach, why this mattered to a student. And in our social justice instruction, are we using meaningful examples that include LGBTQ people? For example, are we talking about how LGBTQ people are at risk in our immigration communities, sometimes from other migrants, sometimes from the authorities, sometimes what would be the tension that a transgender person would face in terms of where they're placed? What about our elders, and how, we think of LGBTQ people when they get older as rich and privileged, but many of them are facing poverty. If you look at the data on this, and how is that leading to homelessness, which is an issue we address. We do anti-racist work. Let's talk about queer people of color and how they're navigating their communities. Remember, those communities are not a monolith, so it's not helpful to say, well, everybody knows the Latinx community is homophobic or the Black community. It's not helpful. Instead, ask people, how are you experiencing your community? The Trevor Project does, though, have some good data here that shows that Latinx people, youth, are 30% more likely to commit suicide. And that's important to know because it's not due to homophobia within their community, but related to issues of migration. So that's where we see these issues coming together, where they're afraid to be deported and detained and think that they would have no future if they're barely accepted, even in their circumstances now. And these are informations any kind of theology teacher or campus minister or service director could bring in. Please come to an understanding, a deeper understanding of what conversion therapy is. I urge this because it's much subtler than what most people think by the stereotypes that we hear of like torture and boot camps. There's a lot of people who approach this issue from more of a, let's have our gender be, real men or real women and healthy relationships, because they believe that sexual orientation is a result of not being bonded to your gender identity in some healthy way, the broken image, as it were. It's important to know that's going on in our communities. And now I'm going to start flipping through the slides pretty quickly, simply because I know that we're running out of time here. So what I have here now are other helpful and not helpful suggestions. Please take the time to pause and read them. Then I have some examples of lessons or topics that could come up in various subjects for other teachers to work with in various departments that could provide organic ways. And then, as I said, please stay for the end, quotes and imagery. And thank you for your time. I'm now going to flip through these pretty quickly. Thank you for your time, and here is my contact information. And please don't hesitate. I'm interested in doing this work, so please don't hesitate to call on me if I can be of help. And I wish you blessings.